Welcome to Curiosity Meets the Past, a podcast for curious minds who love learning about the past. My name is Dr. Smitty Nathan, and I'm an archaeologist and your host. In this episode, I'm speaking with archaeologist and filmmaker Marc Barkman-Astles. Marc has been creating videos on his YouTube channel called Archaeosoup for over 15 years, but you can also find him across the UK teaching history workshops in a diversity of classroom settings. In this episode, he shares what archaeology can contribute to classrooms, and we talk about the type of workshops he does, the challenges he's encountered, and some of the delightful moments along the way. He starts us off with one of the most meaningful moments he's had in the classroom and how that impacts his public work to this day.
The most important moment I remember from being an archaeologist in a classroom of primary school kids, so we're talking, in this instance, they would have been 7 and 8 years old, was when doing a prehistory workshop. It's called Stone Age to Iron Age in the curriculum. That we were talking about the Paleolithic, the oldest of the Stone Ages. And towards the end of that section of the workshop, I sort of said, "Any questions, anyone?" And a little girl put up her hand and said, "Yeah, do we know anyone's names from the Paleolithic?" And my initial response was, "No, I'm sorry, because we don't have any written evidence for the language. But if we did, that'd be amazing, wouldn't it?" And then I sort of asked the class, "What sort of names would you come up with?" And that's where we went. But then on the way home, I realized that there'd recently been, and it's speculative research in that sense, but there'd recently been research that was pointing out, from memory, I think it was 56, possibly 56 hyper-conserved words, so-called, from up to 15,000 years ago. And so words like, I think, black and ash, I think worm was one of them. I ended up making a wee video on my YouTube channel and sending it to the class so they could sort of hear that they'd inspired this answer to their question. But also it was an invitation to them play with those words and come up with little stories and things like that. And what was wonderful about it was that, I was still a working archaeologist in that sense. I still had one toe in the journals or whatever, but I hadn't made the connection until this lovely little girl asked me if we knew anyone's names.
That's amazing and just so sweet and also so
Yeah.
powerful. And I can see how that made an impact on you. And just to orient everyone here, you worked across a lot of classroom settings across England and Wales, and you worked with a range of students. Can you give us a quick background or overview of your classroom teaching history?
15 years ago, there was a big change in the national curriculum. The national curriculum in the UK is broken up into different jurisdictions, and the one that I tend to work within is England and Wales. But they made a shift which was interesting, and that was towards, for example, including things like prehistory and more depth on things like Tudor medicine as opposed to just King Henry VIII, that kind of thing. And therefore, actually, the interaction between archaeology specifically and classroom settings, for the most part, has been primary school, in my experience.
Yeah, so you mentioned national curriculum, and
Yes.
in the US, we also often have curricular goals as well in public education systems. And so I'm wondering, how do you keep in mind these curricular goals, or in some cases requirements, as you're designing lectures or workshops that intertwine public archaeology into the classroom?
Basically, it's about education outcome. So outcome A will be, that they will understand that Stonehenge was built around about this time and this kind of. But I think the most important distinctions has just been to explain why it is that we know this stuff based on essentially rubbish that's left behind. And the curriculum doesn't really say that. And also, I remember as a kid, but then again, clearly I was a nerdy kid. But in my experience, kids love words. They love weird words. And I've never known a child who, for example, plays with dinosaurs or monsters or gets a book about butterflies, not to completely soak up the specifics. I once saw a dad say, "Look at this, look at here's a brontosaurus." This is in a toy shop. Here's a brontosaurus eating a triceratops. And they go, no, Dad, no, they're vegetarians, they're herbivores, but also, Dad, it's a diplodocus or diplodocus. They go, and Dad goes, oh, sorry, and, like, and it actually empowers them as well. It gives them a little bit of a sense of, I know something that my grown-ups don't know. And so I have been involved in situations when I've been consulting on curriculum workshops via third parties. So, for example, some local universities, I won't name them, but local universities. And in those conversations, at one in particular, they were very anxious to use words like Mesolithic, Neolithic, Paleolithic. They didn't want to. They didn't even want to use the word lithic. They just said stone tools, stone age, keep it simple. And I was like, no, no. And they didn't listen, but they did get the feedback actually that it was all a bit confusing because they weren't given the tools to, as I say, stretch out that timeline and just make sense of what they were looking at. So yeah, my consideration has always been to over provide, but in doing so, ironically enough, simplify and aid understanding, I think.
Gotcha. And it seems that in
Mm.
simplifying, we don't have to take away from specificity. And I can
Yeah.
attest that my oldest, who's in first grade now, loves that specificity. But there needs to be a simplification in terms of entry when it comes to concepts. So I totally hear and get what you're saying. And
Mm.
I love that example you provided of the toy store.
Yeah.
I was
Hmm.
wondering if you could provide some examples of the things you do, the lessons, or just, an activity that you do in classrooms, specifically in a primary setting.
Again, thinking about prehistory workshops, one of the things that you cannot do is you cannot take flint into school and start bashing it. Yeah, and also you can't set up a fire, for example, but in the classroom. And one of the things that I was determined to do was to use some of the same concepts that I found so useful as a university student to communicate these ideas effectively to kids. And the flint stuff, though, in connection with the fireplace, I actually landed on something which is essentially a block that can be broken down safely. And I landed on grey florist's foam. So the stuff that florists stick their flowers into and that holds water quite effectively in a flower display, and blunt butter knife. And so I pass it around and I talk about how obviously what you would be doing is hitting using a hammer stone and hitting flint and it shatters like glass. You get these sharp edges. Everyone gets one cut. So they all get to go shk. And it's cheating a bit. If one person had control over it, they'd be able to do this very easily. But because it's being passed around, everyone's got an opinion and they're all sharing their idea. Okay, no, cut here, turn it, cut there. And you're just saying, okay, you're just trying to make one spearhead. And if the spearhead is made by the time we get halfway through, that's fine. Don't worry. The rest of you will get a chance to do something else. But we're not just reducing the size of the foam. So it gets all the way around because everyone wants to have a go, and they end up with this basically this scatter. And I even point that out. I say this is like debitage. This is the stuff that actually we do find as archaeologists. Where's your spearhead? And they'll go, there. And so I'll try and stick it on the end of a piece of bamboo. And what's beautiful about it is that it demonstrates the difficulty of finding the flint tool in the block of flint. It demonstrates that people making stone tools were talking to each other. And it also demonstrates that they had tremendous skill.
Gotcha. And I love how hands-on and engaging it is. And
Mm.
the fact that you're mixing tactile engagement with also social interaction to really, for lack of a better word, hammer in that concept. I'm wondering, what do you think archaeology's superpower is in the classroom?
So I think archaeology's superpower is the fact that it is by definition touchable for the most part, or certainly it's rooted in touchable things. And those touchable things can be anything from your classroom bin at the end of the day, all the way back to people in deep prehistory.
We've talked about certain concepts like specificity, but then, something we also talk a lot about on this channel is nuance. And I think it's absolutely essential to not just
Mm.
the interpretation of the archaeological record, but how we present it. So I'm wondering, how do you approach nuance in the archaeological record across different classroom settings?
Again, I'm going to go back to the prehistory workshops, I think. because often you're invited into settings which are explicitly touched by religion. So, Church of England schools, for example, Catholic schools. And to their credit, this is actually often misunderstood. They are not hyper-religious schools where you only get taught that one religion. In fact, Church of England schools pride themselves on their education as much as possible about other cultures and faiths. So that's not the issue. The issue is sometimes when you're talking about a time that's so far in the past, and people's frame of reference for words like tomb are only people like Lazarus and Jesus. That's when nuance really has to come in. I certainly don't advocate any particular faith perspective in my teaching, but I certainly also as well, I'm aware that I'm a guest in that school, and also they're there to learn about something that's new to them. And so they're using the frames of reference that they have. And those sorts of moments turn up, and there's a point when I'm talking about the Neolithic, and we've laid out this Neolithic village, and one of the people in the classroom has just died. So they take it up to a table, and the wind and the rain get to them. It's an excavation platform, and there's just a skeleton left behind. Again, the kids love the idea that their classmate has rotted away. They're often like, "Rot, yes," and and then bits of those bones, bits of those bodies are sorted, and they end up in the essentially a communal tomb. And I sort of say, well, if this happens over and over again in this community, to you, and maybe it's your nose and your elbow and your teeth. Obviously, I'm being a bit silly there, but if all of that happens over and over again, who's in the tomb? And more often than not, the first answer is Jesus. And I'll be, oh no, this is a long time before that. But it feels like one of the more nuanced moments for me is having to not feel the need to be right or to be accurate about everything in order to be accurate about something, I guess. And so you don't have to say, we don't even know what was going on with that story, that kind of thing. We can just say, no, a long time before that. But who's in the tomb? And then you get back to the concept. And when they eventually go, everyone? And go, yeah, but that's the same as no one, because no one individual can be reconstructed from those bones. And they're like, whoa. So it's just getting over that and getting through it without, I guess, hurting anyone's sense of self. Because also as well, they're not wrong to associate those words. They're very strongly linked in their mind.
Yeah, I totally hear you. And, we've had previous guests on this podcast talk about, approaching nuanced conversations, or I should say challenging conversations sometimes. And sometimes these are with adults, but also, with children who have been, taught a certain worldview or have a certain worldview, and just kind of containing that conversation in some way or redirecting, but also maybe approaching it with different questions that aren't belittling. And in terms of questions, you mentioned this earlier about a great question that you've got that made you think. Is there another example of a question that you've gotten from a student that you found especially surprising?
Well, actually, funnily enough, the Bible Belt in the US. I've actually had a student doing anthropology as part of their degree at a university in the US, and that they were really having trouble going back to their community, and they were struggling because they wanted to share all these cool new ideas, and they just said, "Can you help me to talk and not get angry with people about, for example, evolution? How can I talk to my granddad? How can I talk to my pastor? How can I talk to my family in a way that doesn't sound as though I'm going to be confrontational with them?" And I know this is touching a little bit on what I've already said about nuance. But what was interesting here, though, in terms of question, was that this was one that sometimes there isn't necessarily an answer to, because in this instance, what I recommended, and I thought I was being quite, I've got the answer. I know what the answer is. Talk about farming. Talk about selective breeding. Talk about the fact that farmers change the attributes of their livestock by choosing how, where, and when they get to reproduce, and how they select for maybe body mass, or they select for milk production, this kind of thing. Well, they came back and said they did try this, and what they thought was a good idea ended up actually becoming a horrible experience for them. if anyone's watching this and they're particularly interested in why I do what I do and how I'm doing what I do, and also, frankly, the outcomes that you're aiming for as well with your work, you've got to be able to prepare for those moments when you can't push any further, really. And it's probably more harmful, if for nothing else, for you than it is for them to continue. And so what we ended up doing was we just ended up talking about how he hadn't lost respect for his friends and family. He didn't feel as though he'd been rejected by them. He just felt as though now he had a little space that had to be kept private, or had to be kept just a little bit separate from that home community, because he still had friends back at uni. He still intended to do field work abroad and all this sort of stuff. I learned a lesson there. Even if you think you've got this smooth, ooh, won't be able to dodge this one, answer, it's not always the case.
Thank you so much for sharing that example and being extremely vulnerable about the outcomes and what happened there. What kind of advice would you give to that person now?
I think I would encourage now that person just to reflect upon the fact that there's more, in that sense, there's more to existence than being right and wrong. And it's the full, well, it's Archaeo soup, isn't it? It's the full soup. It doesn't have to be a logic gate, A or B, choose, select, It can simply be, actually, I love the soup that's led you to this point. I love the complicated cultural, historical, personal, familial, psychological, trauma-bound, who knows, all this stuff that feeds into the complicated nature of this person's perspective. And because of that love for that soup, as it were, I don't need to be right in this moment. I think that's probably what I would say. And I say that now, but obviously there are moments when I'm interacting with people online. I'll just be like, this person's such it. Yeah, why can't they just accept that I know what I'm talking about? But at its best, at its most ideal, I would encourage someone to try that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure there are listeners here who are approaching these tough conversations that appreciate hearing your words. To wrap us up here, what do you hope listeners take away from our conversation about public archaeology and what it can bring to the classroom and even beyond?
I think that, in a word, empowerment. And an example of that would be a high school walk that I did a few years ago now, going around Wallsend. So Wallsend is an industrial town. It was, though, originally a Roman settlement at the end of Hadrian's Wall, hence Wallsend. And it's an interesting place because it's very much post-industrial, very much its heyday was like 100 years ago. And walking around, and you're talking to these guys and girls, they're shrugging, they've got their hoods up, and you just start pointing out little things, giving them a sense of the stuff that they walk past every day being nuanced and interesting and telling a story. And at the end of this workshop, we'd been through this walk, and it was on the way back to the high school that one of the lads, who I thought really didn't like me, he comes over and he says, "Do you know what, sir? I'm not going to look at my walk to school the same way ever again." And that was amazing. And he said, "I'm not saying I want to study history, like." It's okay. You don't have to study history. It's fine. But he said, "Yeah, I'm definitely going to remember this, that, and that." And that's what I mean by empowerment. It's the fact that just in the small everyday way, that wherever he goes, he'll have a sense that actually Wallsend isn't just a forgotten town past its heyday. He will know that it was carefully laid out. He'll know that it had a place in that industrial story, and it was connected to the ancient Roman wall, and so on and so forth. That empowerment, that place, that sense of place and self, I think, is crucial. And also, it sets you up to be welcoming. It sets you up to be a good person, I think.
One of my biggest takeaways from this conversation is that archaeology can be a powerful tool to foster connection with the past, the places we live, and each other. If you'd like to follow Marc, you can check out his website, which includes links to his YouTube channel and TikTok. You'll find those links in the show notes, along with the link to a full transcript of this episode. And if you're curious to dig deeper and hear Marc's perspective about the relationship between the media, public, and archaeology, he shares that and more in a Patreon exclusive video. Our Patreon is completely free to join and gives you access to all of our bonus content. If you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, we'd of course appreciate that too. Thanks so much for listening and cultivating your curiosity with us. We'll see you soon.